I was 21 when this happened, living in a quiet rental house just outside a small town in Washington. Back then, my life was simple. I worked part-time at a hardware store, came home, ate the same cheap dinner, and tried to keep myself out of trouble. I wasn't the kind of person who looked for danger, and honestly, nothing about my routine ever felt unusual. Most nights, I get home, kick off my shoes, and sit on the couch while the rain tapped against the windows. That was pretty much the whole rhythm of my life. It was a normal rainy evening like that when everything started. I remember stepping inside after my shift, tossing my wet jacket onto a chair, and taking a moment just to breathe. The house felt warm, quiet, and safe. One of those nights where the air smells like fresh rain and the whole neighborhood seems half asleep. I wasn't expecting anything strange. I wasn't thinking about anything except heating up leftovers and maybe watching a show before bed. I lived alone, but I never felt lonely, and nothing in the house had ever made me uneasy before. I walked through the living room, turning on a few lamps so the place didn't look so dark. The rain outside was steady but calming, the kind of sound that usually made me feel relaxed. I remember opening the fridge, grabbing the container of pasta I'd made the night before, and popping it into the microwave. Everything was normal, boring even. The kind of night where nothing should happen. But while I stood in the kitchen waiting for the microwave to finish, I noticed something that made me pause. At first it didn't even register as anything scary. Just a tiny detail. Something small enough that most people probably wouldn't think twice about it. But it hit me in a strange way because it didn't belong. The floor near the back door was wet. Not soaked. Just a thin line of moisture stretching from the door toward the hallway. At first I thought maybe I had tracked in water earlier, but the pattern didn't match my footsteps. It wasn't a footprint. It wasn't even shaped like anything I recognized. It looked like a trail. A small one. Straight. Like something or someone had dragged something damp across the floor. I remember leaning down, touching it with my fingers. It was cold. Fresh. Not something that had been there long. My first thought was that the rain had leaked through the door somehow, but the weather stripping was perfectly fine. I'd walked in through the front door, not the back. There was no reason for there to be water there at all. And the more I looked at that thin line of moisture, the more uncomfortable I felt. Not scared, just unsettled. Like my brain knew something was off but couldn't figure out what. The microwave beeped, but I didn't move. I just kept staring at that faint wet trail, following it with my eyes as it curved slightly and disappeared into the darker hallway. That was the first moment I felt something was wrong. And I didn't know it yet, but that tiny line of water was the start of a night I still can't forget. The house I was renting at the time sat on a quiet dead-end road about 10 minutes outside town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, older single-story place with wood floors and thin walls that made every gust of wind sound louder than it should. The landlord told me it used to be a vacation place for a retired couple, but they moved out years earlier. By the time I found it, the price was cheap, and the neighborhood seemed calm enough for someone living alone for the first time. Most of the people around me were older, the kind who kept to themselves and waved politely, but didn't talk much. It was early spring, and the rainy season had hit harder than usual. The sky had already gone dark by the time I got home that night, and the storm had been steady for hours. You could hear the rain hitting the windows nonstop, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, but never fully stopping. The whole house smelled faintly of damp wood because of the weather, but after living there a few months, I'd gotten used to it. Nights like this weren't unusual. I'd come home, settle in, and just listen to the storm while I made dinner. Inside, the house was set up simply. The living room opened into a narrow hallway that led to the bedroom, bathroom, and a small storage room I barely used. The kitchen connected to the back door, the same door where I'd noticed the strange wet trail earlier. The lights in the hallway were old and dim, so the deeper part of the house always looked darker than the rest. I didn't mind it most days. It was quiet, and I liked having a place that felt separate from work and everything else going on in my life. I didn't have many people close to me back then. I talked to my sister sometimes, mostly through quick texts, and I saw a couple coworkers during my shift, but that was about it.
No roommates.
No visitors. Nobody who came by unannounced. It was usually just me, the house, and whatever noise the weather made outside. Honestly, That was one reason I liked the place. After busy days at the hardware store, the quiet felt good. That night, I had no plans. I came home the same way I always did. Walked through the living room, turned on the lamps, and went to the kitchen to make dinner. I wasn't thinking about anything but getting out of my wet clothes and relaxing. The trail of water near the back door caught my attention, but even then, I didn't think anything serious was wrong. The rain had been heavy, and I figured maybe the door hadn't been shut tightly earlier, or moisture had blown in through the old frame. I grabbed a towel from under the sink, so I could wipe up the floor. The house creaked lightly as the wind pushed against it, something that never bothered me before. Everything felt normal enough, even with that small, strange detail. At the time, I wasn't expecting anything dangerous. I thought it was just another quiet, rainy night in an old house. Looking back, that calm confidence was the exact reason what happened next caught me so off guard. I bent down with a towel and wiped up the small line of water near the back door. It lifted off the floor easily, like it really had just appeared a few minutes earlier. But as I followed the faint trail into the hallway, the towel barely picked anything up. The farther I went, the drier the floor became, almost like whatever caused the trail had stopped halfway and then vanished. It didn't make sense, but I tried not to overthink it. Old houses can do strange things. Drafts, leaks, condensation. You can blame almost anything on the weather if you try hard enough. Still, something about it felt off. The house was quiet, but not in the usual comfortable way. It was a different kind of quiet, like the air had changed. Heavier. Thicker. I could hear the rain outside, steady and muffled, but inside everything felt too still. It reminded me of those moments in a store right after closing, when the last person leaves and you suddenly become aware of every sound the building makes. When I finished wiping the floor, I tossed the towel on a chair and walked back into the kitchen to grab my dinner. As soon as I stepped in, I froze. The microwave door was slightly open. Not all the way, just cracked. I hadn't touched it since it beeped earlier, and I knew for a fact I hadn't left it that way. I always shut it completely. The old machine wouldn't even run unless the door clicked firmly closed. I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to reason with myself. Maybe I had closed it lightly, and the door bounced back open. Maybe the latch was old and loose. But I'd used it every day for months, and it had never done that before. The small gap in the door bothered me more than the wet trail for reasons I couldn't explain. I pushed the door shut gently, hearing the click. Then I stood still, listening. The house made a soft popping sound as the wind hit the siding. Nothing unusual. But I felt something else, this uneasy sense like someone had just moved through the room a moment before I walked in. Not a sound, not a shadow, just a gut feeling that made my shoulders tense. I tried brushing it off and carried my plate to the living room. I ate quietly, but my attention kept drifting down the hallway. Every so often, I thought I heard something faint, like a soft shuffle or a creak on the wooden floorboards. The kind of noise you hear when someone shifts their weight. But every time I paused the TV and listened, the house went completely silent again. At one point, I turned around because I thought I saw something at the corner of my vision, just the slightest movement near the dark end of the hallway. When I looked, nothing was there. No shadow, no shape, no sound. Just the same dim, narrow space leading toward my bedroom. It should have been nothing. Just a normal house settling. Just the weather. But the longer I sat there, the stronger the feeling grew. I wasn't as alone as I thought. The uneasy feeling kept growing, and after a while I couldn't sit still anymore. I paused the TV again and listened, trying to convince myself I was being dramatic, but something in the house felt different. The storm outside hadn't changed, but the air inside seemed colder, heavier. Like a door had been opened somewhere. Or like someone was standing just out of sight. I finally got up to check the hallway. The lights were dim, the kind of yellow glow that barely reached the far end near the bedroom. The rain sounded louder from there, maybe because the back of the house faced the woods. I stood at the entrance of the hallway for a moment, staring into the dark space. I didn't hear anything at first, so I started walking slowly, telling myself I'd feel better if I checked each room. When I reached the bedroom door, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The door was open wider than I had left it. I always kept it just slightly cracked, barely an inch, out of habit. But now it was open a good foot, maybe more. Enough that you could see part of the room inside. I tried to remember if I had pushed it open earlier, but I hadn't even gone in there since getting home. I reached for the light switch, but before I touched it, I heard it. A soft, quick sound from inside the bedroom. Not loud. Not obvious. Just a small shifting noise, like fabric moving or someone brushing lightly against something. I froze completely. I tried to convince myself it was something simple. The wind shaking the old frame, or clothes settling on a chair. But the sound didn't fit. It was too controlled, too deliberate. And it came from deeper in the room. My heart started beating faster. I stood there for a long moment, not breathing, listening hard. The sound didn't come again, but the silence that followed felt worse. It wasn't the normal quiet of an empty room. It felt like someone holding still, waiting. I stepped back slowly, trying not to make noise. I didn't want whoever, or whatever, was in that room to know I had heard them. My throat tightened as I backed into the hallway. I kept my eyes on the open bedroom door, expecting to see it move or see something step out. Nothing happened, but the pressure in my chest kept rising. I moved toward the living room again, but before I turned the corner, I heard another sound, this time from behind me. A faint, soft click, like the sound of weight shifting on a wooden board. Not in the bedroom. In the hallway. Much closer. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. Just that dim glow stretching toward the back of the house. But I knew I had heard it. Someone had stepped. Not heavy, not fast, but real. That was the moment it fully hit me. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overthinking. Someone was in the house. And they were close, too close for me to pretend otherwise. The feeling of being watched wasn't a guess anymore. It was certain. And the house suddenly felt too small, too quiet, and too closed off to escape easily. I stood there in the hallway, staring down the dim stretch of floorboards, every muscle locked tight. I knew what I heard. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the storm. Someone had taken a step, slow and controlled, like they were trying not to be noticed. The kind of step a person makes when they're already in your home, and they don't want you to know exactly where they are. My instinct told me to run out the front door, but the living room felt too open. Too exposed. If someone stepped out from the hallway or the bedroom, I'd be trapped in the middle of the house with nowhere to go. My phone was in the kitchen, just a few steps from where I was standing, but so was the back of the house and the dark hallway where I'd heard the noise. I forced myself to move slowly into the kitchen, trying to keep my breathing quiet. The rain pounded against the back windows, drowning out smaller noises. I hated that. It meant someone could be walking behind me, and I might not hear it until they were too close. When I reached the counter, I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and turned toward the front door. That's when I heard it. A low creak, long, slow, unmistakable, coming from the hallway behind me.
Not a footstep this time.
It was the sound of someone leaning their weight into the floor like they were watching me, like they were waiting for the right moment. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I saw anything standing there, I knew I'd freeze. I moved fast, running straight for the living room. My socks slipped a little on the floor, but I pushed forward and reached the front door. I twisted the lock with trembling fingers. Then I froze again. The front door chain latch was hooked. I never used that chain. Not once. I always locked the deadbolt and left the chain hanging. But now it was in place. Someone had locked it from the inside at some point that night. My stomach dropped. That meant they'd been in the house long before I ever noticed anything. I fumbled with the chain, trying to unhook it, but my hands were shaking too badly. Behind me, I heard another creak, closer this time. Then a slow inhale. A human inhale. Someone was standing at the edge of the hallway. I didn't turn around. I shoved the chain free, yanked the door open, and ran out into the rain as fast as I could. Cold water hit my face, but I didn't stop. I sprinted across the yard, down the driveway, and straight into the street, slipping on the wet pavement but not falling. When I finally looked back, I saw it, the silhouette of a man standing in my doorway.
Tall.
Completely still. just watching me through the rain. He didn't chase me. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, half in shadow, like he had all the time in the world. I ran to my neighbor's house and pounded on the door until they let me in. They called the police while I tried to breathe, trying not to look out the window. Terrified, he had followed me. I didn't know it yet, but the real horror wasn't over. The worst part was still coming. The police arrived within minutes, though it felt like an hour. 2 officers searched the house while I stayed inside my neighbor's living room wrapped in a blanket, trying to steady my breathing. My neighbor kept asking if I was okay, but I barely heard anything. My mind was stuck on that image. The man standing in my doorway, still and silent like he belonged there. When the officers came back, their expressions told me something wasn't normal. They didn't say much at first, just asked me to walk them through everything again when I got home, what I heard, what I saw. I repeated everything as clearly as I could. They listened carefully, exchanging looks every now and then, which only made my anxiety worse. Then one of them asked a question that hit me wrong. "Has anything in your house gone missing lately? Even small things?" I said no. Nothing had changed. Nothing I noticed. The officer nodded slowly, then asked another question. "Have you ever checked the crawl space under your house?" I stared at him. I honestly hadn't even thought about that space since moving in. The opening to it was in the small storage room at the end of the hallway, the same hallway where I heard footsteps. I told him I never used that room except to store a few boxes. They exchanged another look. "We need you to stay here for a bit," one of them said. "We're going to take another look." Those minutes were some of the longest of my life. I kept imagining that man crouched under the house, waiting, listening to every move I made for days or weeks. The thought alone made me feel sick. When the officers finally returned, they looked different, more serious, more tense. One of them crouched a little to meet my eyes. "We found evidence someone has been living under your house for a while." My stomach dropped so fast it felt like the floor disappeared. They explained that the crawl space wasn't empty. There was an old sleeping bag, food wrappers, empty water bottles, and a small pile of clothes stacked neatly in one corner. Some of the items were ones I recognized from my own kitchen: cans of soup, granola bars, snacks I thought I had finished or misplaced. He had been taking things quietly, little by little, just enough that I didn't notice. That wasn't the worst part. The officers found a small hole in the floorboards near the storage room. It led directly into the hallway. From that hole, someone could see movement, legs, shadows, footsteps. They could hear everything. They could tell when I was home, when I was asleep, when I was distracted. And right next to that hole, they found something else. A notebook. Inside were pages filled with short, simple notes. My schedule. Times I usually left for work. Times I came home. What lights I turned on. What rooms I used the most. Even small observations like, "He doesn't lock the back door all the way. Bedroom door open slightly. Stays in living room at night." The officers both agreed on one thing. The man hadn't just broken in that night. He had been watching me, listening to me, living underneath me. For weeks. The police stayed at my place for hours after finding the crawl space set up. They took pictures, collected the notebook, and tried to track any prints or signs of where the man might have gone after I ran out. But the storm had ruined almost everything outside. Any footprints in the mud, any trace along the driveway, all washed away by the rain. They told me they searched the surrounding woods and checked nearby properties, but they didn't find him. Not a single sign. He was still in the area. It was like he disappeared the moment he stepped out of my doorway. One of the officers said it wasn't uncommon for people like that to move fast, especially if they'd been hiding for a long time and knew all the exits better than the homeowner. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed at my neighbor's place, sitting on their couch with the lights on. Every sound made me jump. A branch hitting the window. A car passing. Even the wind shifting. My body stayed tense the entire time, like I was waiting for that same slow creak in the hallway to happen again. The next morning, the landlord came out to look at the crawl space. He seemed genuinely shocked. He told me he had no idea anyone could get under there so easily. The hatch had a loose latch, something he said he meant to fix months earlier but forgot about. Hearing that only made the whole thing feel worse. That one simple oversight was what let a stranger live under my house, without me knowing. I asked the officers if they thought the man had planned to hurt me. They didn't give me a clear answer. One of them just said, "People don't take notes like that for nothing." Another added that whoever he was, he had a pattern, watching me, studying me, learning when I was most vulnerable. They recommended I stay somewhere else for a few days. I didn't argue. I packed a small bag and stayed with my sister 2 towns over. She tried to comfort me, telling me it could have been worse, that I got lucky by noticing the water on the floor. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the only reason I noticed anything was because he made a mistake. And someone that careful, someone who lived inches beneath me without a sound, doesn't make many mistakes. A few days later, I went back to get the rest of my things. I didn't plan on staying in that house again. While packing up, I kept catching myself glancing toward the hallway, expecting to see a shadow standing there. Even after knowing he was gone, the house still felt occupied, like it remembered him. Before leaving for good, I walked through one last time. When I reached the back door, the same spot where I found the first wet trail, I noticed something small wedged under the doorframe. A thin strip of mud.
Fresh.
Not from me. Not from the rain. Just a thin line. Straight. Exactly like the one I'd seen that first night. The police said the man might have moved on. They said there was no reason he would come back. But every now and then, especially on rainy nights, I still think about that mud. And I still wonder if he ever really left at all.